From simple demolition derby racer to over-the-top cartoon vehicular combat, spawning many a spiritual successor, today we are going to be looking at the history behind the Destruction Derby franchise. Welcome end users to Retro Game Shelf. The year is 1984, and the United States is on the brink of a video game resurgence with the upcoming release of the NES. Meanwhile, over here in Britain, things were still chugging along merrily due to the popularity of home computer game systems, such as the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, the Acorn Electron, and the upcoming Amiga 1000. It was this year that Martin Edmondson started developing games for the BBC Micro, alongside Nicholas Chamberlain. They created a couple of titles, namely an unreleased Paperboy clone titled Paper Round, and an adventure game titled Ravenskull, which was released in 1986 for the BBC Micro and the Acorn Electron. Despite being founded in 1984, it wasn't until 1989 that the Reflections name started being used on their games. This was first noted with the release of the well-known Amiga title Shadow of the Beast. Ported to many a system down the line and published by the much-loved Psygnosis, who were also founded in 1984, Shadow of the Beast would go on to enjoy a couple of sequels, both in 1990 and later in 1992. Numerous games were subsequently released for various home computing systems, including 1989's Ballistics, 1990's Awesome, and 1994's Brian the Lion. But it wasn't until 1995 that Reflections were thrown into the public spotlight, when they became known for the very first Destruction Derby game. Now, in order to fully understand the importance of Destruction Derby, we must first rewind a year back to 1994, a time when the brand new PlayStation was all the rage, and its seminal racer and launch title Ridge Racer was the game to beat. Development on Destruction Derby began in late 1994 and progressed quickly with Martin Edmondson's lead. One notable difference between other racing games and Destruction Derby were its damage physics, which were extremely impressive for the mid-90s, on all home video game systems. Mr. Edmondson believed that the game would be completely unplayable, without real-time simulated damage physics, comparing the experience to playing pool when the collisions are all off. Due to the high demand for these real-time physics and the team wanting to get the perfect balance between realism and playability, a lot of optimization was required, resulting in heavy emphasis on simple LOD objects for distant assets and single wireframe meshes for vehicles. Due to these optimizations, as well as the tight tracks, the team were able to keep the density of the cars on the track very high. Destruction Derby was released in late 1995 for MS-DOS and PlayStation, to critical acclaim, with the Electric Playground commenting, "Destruction Derby is a winner in every capacity," and PC Gamer US praising the game, stating, "Destruction Derby is a blast and a welcoming change of pace from high-end driving simulations." The game was later ported to Sega Saturn by the team that handled the majority of Psygnosis Sega Saturn ports, Perfect Entertainment. Upon its release in 1996, it was noted that due to the limitations of the Sega Saturn and its complex hardware, the game itself lacks features that are present in both the MS-DOS and PC releases, including transparencies. Couple these omissions with a generally poorer frame rate, and the game ultimately received a largely unfavourable response from critics, with Computer and Video Games noting that the port did not have the sheen and glossiness of its PlayStation counterpart, and that it was a haphazard conversion.
We are 5 years away from entering the 21st century.
In 1998, a Nintendo 64 spin-off of the game was announced, under development by Looking Glass Studios and ultimately published by THQ under license from Psygnosis. The oft-maligned Destruction Derby 64 was released in 1999, to a fairly favourable response from critics, noting the improved visuals compared to the original release and the more arcade controls. GameSpot wrote, "Graphically, Destruction Derby 64 surpasses the old PlayStation games quite a bit. Not that that is particularly a hard thing to do." Destruction Derby would go on to become one of the first games to achieve platinum sales and was subsequently released as part of the PlayStation Platinum range, also known as the Greatest Hits range in North America. Whilst Destruction Derby was proving to be a hit with the public upon its release, it was all hands on deck for Reflections, as they were hard at work on the sequel, Destruction Derby 2. The development of Destruction Derby 2 began almost immediately after the release of the original game, and it started as a direct response to the original game and its extremely short 7-month development time, with Martin Edmondson stating that the original title suffered from design flaws and unimplemented ideas that were left on the cutting room floor. This new title was a complete rewrite of the original, with only a few minor algorithms remaining from the first Destruction Derby. The engine, car physics, dynamic features and collisions were all rewritten and improved significantly over the original game. Martin Edmondson felt that Destruction Derby had a very British banger racing feel to it and wanted the new title to be a completely Americanized take on the sport, and so he visited stock car racing events in the United States to try and match that style. He noted that metal music was a big part of American stock racing at the time, and so the decision to include thrash metal bands Jug and Tuscan was made. He also acquired commentator Paul Page for the over-the-top commentary that features in the game. The product itself was designed to have a distinct and exclusively American feel to it. Due to the complete overhaul of the entire engine, the new title allowed for much larger and much more complex tracks, as well as more detailed crashes, including the ability to roll cars over. Parts would fly, paint would fly, and explosions were commonplace. Despite being a much faster and much more accessible game than the previous title, Edmondson didn't want the game to feel like an arcade game, and so that balance between realism and playability again became a factor, and the decision was made for the game to be a fast-paced racer with realistic handling and car physics. Destruction Derby 2 was released on PlayStation and PC in late 1996, and just like the original, it was an instant hit and was praised by the critics, with Edge praising the new engine, Game Revolution describing the game as almost perfect, and GameZilla describing the game's graphics as top-notch. The PC version, however, received a more mixed response, with its high system requirements and lack of multiplayer being heavily criticised, with Gamer Zone complimenting the audio and visuals, but criticising the difficulty and describing the game overall as an average game that could have been an excellent title. In 1997, Destruction Derby 2 would, just like its predecessor, also become a part of the PlayStation Platinum range. After the release of Destruction Derby 2, there were a lot of shake-ups within the video game industry, and the Destruction Derby franchise fell victim to these shake-ups. In May of 1998, developer Reflections changed its name to Reflections Interactive. They would go on to develop the beloved Driver franchise, and this is where their story ends in relation to Destruction Derby. As for Psygnosis, in 1993 they were acquired by Sony Electronic Publishing, and in 2000 Psygnosis and the majority of its smaller studios were either closed or restructured after the Sony Computer Entertainment takeover. Psygnosis as a publisher would be merged into Sony Computer Entertainment Europe as a whole, and the beloved Psygnosis name and owl were dropped completely in favour of Sony Computer Entertainment Studio Liverpool. Along with the closures and restructuring of other Psygnosis studios, this marked the final step towards full integration of the studio within Sony Computer Entertainment. As a result of Sony buying out Psygnosis in the early 90s, a small development studio was formed, comprising of Psygnosis employees. This studio was named Studio 33. Studio 33 had created a few racing games during their time, including Newman Haas Racing and Formula 1 99, both of which were criticised for their impossible AI tactics. In 1999, Studio 33 began development on a new title. Word began spreading amongst video game magazines, and a few very early previews were showcased of a new title in the Destruction Derby franchise. A new title called Destruction Derby 3. It's safe to assume that these early previews were never intended to be reminiscent of the final product, and despite the tracks featured in these screens eventually making their way into the final game, it's clear to see that the majority of the art and texture work is most definitely placeholder. During development, previews of the game would make their way to various video game magazines, and before long, the game was renamed to Destruction Derby Raw. Destruction Derby Raw differs itself from the previous two games in the franchise by featuring various different modes. The old Wreckin' Racing is still present, but the game now features a career progression mode titled Smash for Cash, various multiplayer battle modes, and all new game modes within the classic Destruction Derby bowls, not to mention the addition of skyscrapers. Destruction Derby Raw was released in 2000 only on the PlayStation, and it was one of the last games to be released with the Psygnosis logo, before the Sony Computer Entertainment Europe merger was finalised. Psygnosis also entered into a publishing deal with Midway for the North American release. It released to a fairly positive response. Critics were quick to praise its graphics, features, damage physics, and scoring system, with GameSpot stating, "The game actually has a number of excellent new gameplay features, and the background detail is the highest it has ever been in a Destruction Derby game." 2002, Destruction Derby Raw would also become a part of the PlayStation Platinum range. Following the platinum sales of Destruction Derby Raw, it was announced in April 2002 Destruction Derby 4 would begin development for the PlayStation 2, and it would again be under the control of Studio 33. The development of Destruction Derby 4 lasted around 2 years, spanning most of 2002 up until its 2004 release. During this time, it, like its predecessor Destruction Derby Raw, received a name change, and in mid-2003 it was leaked that the game would be titled Destruction Derby Arenas. The official Destruction Derby Arenas website was launched later that year. During the development of Destruction Derby Arenas, Studio 33 were acquired by Electronic Arts. They were immediately relocated to Warrington and became EA Northwest, making Destruction Derby Arenas Studio 33's final game. The game takes a completely different approach to the series, more so than any of the games before it. It is very light in tone and in art style, with many aspects of the game being quite cartoony. The graphics were of course a huge improvement over its predecessors, and the game was one of the first PlayStation 2 games to feature online play. Destruction Derby Arenas released in 2004 for the PlayStation 2. Published by Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, in Europe, and Gathering of Developers in North America. The game was received with a mixed to somewhat poor reception, with GameSpot giving it a 6.2 out of 10, and stating that the graphics could have been better, and the online modes in the game should have also been available offline. Destruction Derby Arenas would ultimately be the last game in the Destruction Derby franchise to date. A franchise that became a pioneer in the racing game genre, witnessed huge shake-ups within the video game industry and came back strong, only to have its light fizzled out with just a whimper. The Destruction Derby series is one of my favourite video game franchises to ever have been created. The very first Destruction Derby game piqued my now obsessive interest in games with vehicle destruction. Games such as Demolition Racer, Grand Theft Auto 4, Crashed, the Burnout franchise, and the Carmageddon franchise, and more. But this was the game that started it. Upon its release, I got Destruction Derby 2, and it only improved on the formula of the first game. Even today, it's still an extremely fun and satisfying game to play, and one that I enjoy going back to. Destruction Derby Raw quickly became my favourite game in the franchise, as it slowed the pace of Destruction Derby 2 down and offered more detailed and realistic crashes. It would even reward you for them. And finally, Destruction Derby Arenas. An enjoyable racer with an interesting plot and some fun characters. Maybe it wasn't the game that it should have been, but it was not a bad game, and it was a nice way for the series to go out on a high with something just a little bit different. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed this look back at the history of the Destruction Derby franchise. If you enjoyed this video, then check out some of my other videos, and if you want more content like this, then don't hesitate to visit my Patreon, where you can get various rewards and even request what games you would like to see the history of in the future. With Patreon, you can become an official end user of the Retro Game Shelf and be rewarded for helping me put out some great content. Thank you again, and as always, game on, end users.